London, 1906. Just as the bells of St. Paul's tolled noon and the soot-streaked air hung heavy over Grosvenor Square, Winifred Hale gripped the handle of her mop until her knuckles turned white. The marble floor of Viscount Strickland's townhouse sprawled beneath her like a battlefield, specked with muddy footprints from the morning's fox hunt. She scrubbed harder, her back aching from hours stooped in silence. The housekeeper had warned her not to speak unless spoken to. Winifred had been in service long enough to know how invisible someone like her was meant to be. But she had also learned how to listen. From behind the drawing-room doors, voices rose first sharp, then bitter. "You'll not marry a woman with no title, Samuel," came the clipped voice of the Dowager Lady Strickland. "Your father would rise from the grave." "I'll not tie myself to a painted shell for the convenience of her pedigree," said a younger male voice, low and direct. Winifred froze. That had to be him. Samuel Strickland, the new Viscount. She had seen him only once since he returned from South Africa, taller than expected, wiry, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that didn't linger on anyone too long. He had passed her in the corridor, and she'd caught a glimpse of a scar along his jaw. Not from war, the cook had said, but a duel in Kimberley over a debt not his own. The door flew open, and the Viscount strode out, not seeing her at first. His boots stopped inches from her bucket. Winifred stood quickly, nearly knocking the pail over. Pardon me, sir." His head turned. His eyes, a dark hazel, met hers. He looked at her properly now, not through her. "You're new," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord." "What's your name?" "Winifred Hale." His eyes flicked to the mop, then back to her face. "You clean the floors like you're trying to erase something." "I suppose I am," she said before she could stop herself. He tilted his head, then walked past her without another word. That evening, as she polished the brass stair rails, Winifred heard footsteps again, softer this time. "Miss Hale." She turned. He wasn't wearing his jacket, just shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. "My study's a mess. Do you take fireside ash, or is that someone else's task?" She hesitated. "I can take it." He stepped aside to let her pass, but not before handing her a folded paper. "Found this under one of the carpets. Thought it might be yours." It wasn't, but it was a note. She waited until she was alone in the scullery to open it. "You listen more wisely than most who speak. That's worth more than a dozen titled wives." Her breath caught. A week passed, then another. He began to appear more often, asking for tea before supper, requesting fires stoked in rooms he never used. One rainy afternoon, she entered the library to collect the tea tray and found him at the window, a book in one hand. "Do you think they know?" he asked. "Who, my lord?" "The birds. That they're only safe behind glass. That if they flew too far, someone would cage them." She didn't answer. He turned to her. "You read, don't you?" "A little." "I need a tutor," he said plainly. "For my cousin's boy. The one my mother won't acknowledge. No governess will come." "Too many questions. You want me to teach him? You and I both know you clean better than you're paid for. Something tells me you think better, too." Her heart thudded. "What's the boy's name?" "Victor." Winifred met him the next morning in the unused nursery. Victor was pale, with a stammer and a constant cough. She brought slates and chalk. He clung to her apron at first, but by week's end, he was reading aloud. Samuel watched from the threshold sometimes. Not speaking, just watching. One evening, as she left Victor's room, he caught up with her on the stair. "You've done more for him in a fortnight than my family ever has." "I only gave him what he needed." He reached out, brushing a curl from her face with his gloved hand. "You do that for everyone, don't you?" She stepped back. "I'm a cleaning girl, my lord. Nothing more." He frowned. "Don't lie, Winifred. Not to me." The next day, the house buzzed with whispers. Lady Araminta Norwich was to arrive. The Dowager's choice. A woman with a bloodline older than the Crown's and a heart like a brick. Winifred saw her once stepping from her carriage in peacock silk, her nose wrinkled at the smell of coal smoke. "She'll never love him," Winifred whispered to herself, scrubbing the entry tiles harder than she should. She didn't notice Samuel until he knelt beside her, took the brush from her hand, and said, "Then stop letting them choose for me." "You're a Viscount," she said, "and I'm just—" "No," he interrupted. "You're the woman who taught a boy to read and made a man remember what decency is." A servant turned the corner. They sprang apart. Later that night, She found another note tucked behind her apron hook. Meet me in the garden at midnight. There's something I must say before it's too late. She went. Of course she went. Rain drizzled over the hedges, and the cold bit at her sleeves. But when she saw him there, coat over his arm, hair damp, she forgot the shiver in her bones. I challenged Lord Norwich's heir, he said. At dawn. For her honor, they said. But it was for something else. Her breath hitched. You can't. He stepped closer. I already did. Then you'll die. He shook his head. I won't. I've dueled before. And I've something to fight for now. She looked at him, rain dripping from his brow, and realized he meant her. Winifred Hale, he said, voice low and steady. You're not just a cleaning girl. You are the only woman I have ever met who looks at me like I'm a man, not a title. That means more than everything. She wanted to speak, to say she'd waited her whole life for someone to see her. Instead, she reached for his hand. And for a moment, there was nothing but the rain, and their joined fingers, and the quiet beat of something beginning. Wind rattled the glass panes of the conservatory as dawn crept across the gray London skyline, dull and watchful. Winifred stood behind the frost-laced window, her apron still damp from the rain-soaked garden. She hadn't slept. The chill of the night clung to her bones, and the scent of wet roses still lingered on her sleeves. In the courtyard below, Samuel's coat moved in sharp arcs. The duel had begun. She hadn't wanted to come, but something in her refused to stay blind behind the scullery door another moment. She watched every step, every darting shift of his boots across the gravel. Lord Norwich's son was heavier, slower, but he swung with the confidence of someone used to winning. Winifred pressed her hand flat against the glass as Samuel ducked a blow and turned, angling with precision. The blade caught the other man's arm, and the seconds shouted, breaking the spell. It was over. She didn't wait to see more. She fled to the nursery, heart pounding, where Victor was still asleep, his blanket kicked to the floor. She bent to cover him again, her hands trembling. A warm weight settled in her chest. He was alive. Later that morning, the household buzzed with a hushed energy, like something had cracked just beneath the surface. The nursemaid whispered that Samuel had won cleanly, that there would be no charges, but Lady Norwich had taken it as an insult. By noon, Winifred was summoned to the study. She entered with her hands folded in front of her, her shoes damp. The fire was lit, and Samuel stood by the hearth, his arm bound in linen. You shouldn't have watched, he said quietly. I couldn't not, she answered. He turned, eyes darker today. I didn't do it for some gallant cause. I did it because I wanted to choose who I stand beside, and I will not be told that love must come second to bloodlines. She kept her gaze steady. Do you think love alone is enough to keep the world from closing its doors? No, he admitted, but I think it's the only reason worth opening them. He stepped toward her and stopped just short of touching. I've written to my solicitor. The entail on the estate ends with me. I can name my heir. I can marry as I choose. Her breath came shallow. Your mother will disown you. She already has, he said quietly. When I came back from the Cape, I wasn't the son she remembered. I learned to see people for what they do, not where they're born. She looked down at the worn edge of the carpet. I have no family name, no dowry. I can't give you alliances or land or anything but a loyal heart. He reached out slowly, as if unsure whether he was allowed. His fingers brushed hers. You gave Victor his voice. You gave me mine. That's more than any title. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But the silence between them deepened, not with hesitation, but with trust. That evening, the butler, Mr. Hennings, approached her in the corridor. He held out a sealed envelope. From the Viscount, he said with a stiff nod. I was told to place it directly in your hand. Inside, scrawled in Samuel's neat script. Meet me tomorrow at St. Margaret's, Westminster. No one will stop us there. She barely slept. By the time the sky blushed pale over the rooftops, she had borrowed a dress from the cook's niece, a soft blue wool with a hem just long enough to hide her ankles. She pinned her hair high and fastened the brooch her mother had left behind before the fever took her. It was the only thing she'd kept. A hired carriage waited at the corner, one of the plain ones, without livery. The driver tipped his hat and didn't ask her name. St. Margaret's stood quiet in the morning mist, its stone walls lit by slanting gold. He was already inside, near the altar, a simple band resting in his gloved hand. I thought you might not come, he said. I thought I might faint, she replied. He smiled not with triumph, but with something gentler, as if gratitude had replaced ambition. The vicar, an old friend of Samuel's late father, performed the ceremony without questions. Only the sound of their voices, quiet and sure, filled the nave. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, her hand stopped shaking. When she said, "I will," it was not defiance. It was peace. They stepped into the morning as husband and wife, and for the first time since she'd entered the Strickland household, the world no longer looked like something she had to endure. It looked like something she had the right to shape. And beside her stood a man who had chosen her not as an ornament, not as a rebellion, but as his equal. Samuel offered his arm. Winifred took it. They walked forward together, not as lord and servant, but as two people who had seen each other clearly and chosen not to look away. The sitting room smelled of beeswax and old paper, its windows drawn against the early February chill. Winifred shifted her weight as the tailor's assistant circled her with a measuring tape, murmuring over lengths and seams. She didn't fidget, though the pins in her sleeves itched. A month married, and she still startled when someone called her Lady Strickland. Across the room, Samuel leaned against the mantel, his coat undone and a letter dangling from his fingers. "The Earl of Weatherby wrote again," he said, watching the fire rather than her. "He's asked us to attend the spring session at Holcombe. There'll be petitioners. Agricultural leases up for renewal. He wants me to vote on irrigation tariffs." Winifred met his gaze in the mirror's reflection. "Will they let me speak?" He looked at her now, eyes alert. "They'll have to." The assistant jotted a final note and excused herself with a shallow curtsy. When the door clicked shut, Winifred turned. "You're certain this is wise?" "What? Bringing me to Holcombe? You know what they'll say." Samuel folded the letter and tucked it into his breast pocket. "I don't care what they say. I care whether you want to come." She considered the question. "I don't know. I've never been anywhere that wasn't someone else's world." "Then let's make it ours." He said it simply, without flourish, and something in her steadied. That afternoon, she visited Victor in the schoolhouse Samuel had converted from an old carriage barn. The boy sat at his desk, head bent over a botanical sketch. The tutor, a pale, round-shouldered man from Sussex, rose when she entered, bowing awkwardly. "I'll only be a moment," she said, crossing to the desk. Victor looked up, his eyes brighter than she remembered. "Did you draw that?" she asked, gesturing to the page. He nodded. "It's aconitum. Deadly if you eat it." She crouched beside him. "And yet it blooms like anything else." He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "Are you really a lady now?" She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I'm still me." "That's good," he said, returning to his drawing. She left with a heaviness she couldn't name. Not sadness, not fear. Something closer to awe. That evening, as snow began to fall in silent flurries, they dined in the smaller of the two parlors. Samuel uncorked a bottle of claret and poured for them both. The fire cast shifting shadows across the carpet, and the silverware gleamed dully in the low light. "Do you miss it?" he asked, cutting into his roast. "The rhythm of it all." She tilted her head. "Of what?" "Work that left your hands raw. Days you could vanish without notice." She set down her fork. "I miss knowing what I was meant to do. The rest, the silence, the bruises I've let go." He nodded slowly. "They won't. The rest of them. The wives at Holcombe, the aunts in Hampshire. They'll see a girl who scrubbed tiles and call it an insult." "I won't kneel for them," she said plainly. "Not now." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Then let's make sure they learn to stand." Later, she stood at the window in her nightgown, watching frost lace the panes. Samuel approached, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders. "I had a dream last night," he said, voice low, "that I was still in the Cape. And when I turned, you were there, handing Victor a book." She leaned into him, her cheek against his shoulder. Perhaps it wasn't a dream. He kissed her temple, slow and certain. "I never believed in fate, but I believe in consequence. And I don't want a future that doesn't carry the weight of what we've done to earn it." Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, soft and persistent. Inside, the fire burned low, and the silence between them was not empty, but full of memory, of choice, of a life unfolding not by accident, but by intention. She turned to him, her hand resting over his heart. "When we go to Holcombe," she said. I will walk beside you, not behind. And he answered, without hesitation, as it should be. The train to Norfolk trembled gently beneath their feet, its velvet seats faded but clean, the windows rimmed with condensation that blurred the passing countryside into a smear of gray and green. Winifred sat across from Samuel, her gloves folded neatly in her lap, her satchel tucked beside her boots. Every so often, she glanced at the passing fields, the bare hedgerows, the thatched hamlets crouching under a low sky. He watched her without speaking. When the whistle blew for Thetford Junction, she turned to him. Have you written to your steward? He nodded. He's arranged quarters at the vicarage for Victor and his tutor. I thought you'd want to see it before we settle in. She gave a quiet hum of assent. I want him near us. But not under the eyes of those women. Samuel leaned back, his gaze steady. They'll come with their questions, Winnie. They'll want to know where you learned to hold your back straight, to pronounce your vowels. They'll look for the cracks. Then let them, she said. They've spent their lives steered by fear. I won't be. When they arrived at Holcombe Hall, the house loomed long and pale against the sea-bound sky, its colonnades swept by wind. A footman in livery opened the carriage door, and as Winifred stepped onto the gravel drive, she felt the weight of 100 eyes most unseen settle onto her shoulders. Inside, the drawing-room was already thick with the scent of lavender sachets and polished wood. 3 ladies stood beneath a portrait of the late Queen, their gloved hands curled around teacups. Your lordship, came the eldest's voice, smooth with practiced welcome. We hadn't expected you until tomorrow. Samuel bowed with a formality Winifred had not yet seen in him. Lady Fenton, Miss Deering. Lady Halewell, he said, nodding to each. May I present my wife, Winifred? Not a single teacup rattled, but the silence after his words was louder than any dropped tray. Lady Halewell's smile never faltered. Mrs. Strickland, she said, as though correcting a child's grammar. How lovely. Winifred inclined her head. Lady Halewell. Her voice was calm. The pleasure is not mine yet, but I hope it may become so. Lady Fenton narrowed her eyes and turned to Samuel. You'll join us in the salon after supper, I trust? The Earl wishes to discuss the tenant allotments. I'll be there, he said. Then, offering his arm to Winifred, we'll settle in first. Their chambers were modest by Holcombe standards, but the fire was lit and the linen warm. She moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy drapery. The sea was visible in the distance, a silver thread between the trees. Samuel unbuttoned his coat without speaking. After a moment, he asked, Do you miss London? She turned slowly. No. But I miss being unknown. He came to stand behind her, not touching, just close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence. I think you were always meant to be seen. You just grew used to shadows. That evening, a footman brought a note while she was brushing her hair. It was sealed with the Strickland crest. Inside, in Samuel's careful hand, were only 6 words. You need not walk behind me. She folded it and placed it in the pocket of her robe. At supper, she entered the dining hall on his arm, her gown simple but well made, a soft gray crepe with a high collar and narrow sleeves. The other women wore lace and brocade, their brooches gleaming like metals, their expressions unreadable. The conversation turned to tariffs, to the cost of wheat, to the new land surveyor appointed by the Earl. Samuel spoke sparingly, his voice measured. When Lady Fenton lamented the rise of tenant complaints, Winifred cleared her throat. Perhaps, she said evenly, if they had water that did not sour after a week, they might voice fewer grievances. The silence was instant. Samuel did not look at her. He did not need to. The room shifted. And how would you know about such matters? Lady Fenton asked, her spoon still poised over her consommé. I was raised near Islington, Winifred replied. The women there boiled every drop twice, and still their children coughed blood. I imagine Norfolk's poor are not so different. Lady Halewell set down her glass. You've a sharp tongue, Mrs. Strickland. She has a clear memory, Samuel said calmly, and I trust it. After supper, as the men remained behind for port, Winifred excused herself and walked alone into the stone courtyard. The wind had quieted, and the moonlight cast long shadows across the cloistered walk. She heard footsteps. Samuel joined her, a wool cloak thrown over his shoulders. You didn't need to speak. I did, she said. Because they won't stop whispering until someone teaches them to stop. He looked at her, and for the first time since they'd arrived, a smile flickered at the edge of his mouth, quiet, private. I married you because you speak when the world wants silence. She reached for his hand, bare now, and curled her fingers between his. We haven't won anything yet, she said. No, he replied. But we're not losing either. They stood in the courtyard as the stars pressed through the clouds, their hands clasped, Viscount and cleaning girl, husband and wife, no longer stepping through separate doors.